Her name was torn apart by those who tried to break her. A black woman fighting not just the system, but herself, for justice. When everything she loved collapsed, she didn't back down. What she did next shocked even the hardest of them all. But let's start from the beginning. James Williams, a black man in his late 30s, stood tall, despite the weight of years lost to a broken justice system. His face, weathered by time and hardship, bore the scars of a past no one could see, years spent behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Wrongfully convicted of drug possession, James had fought tooth and nail to prove his innocence. The trial had been nothing more than a cruel charade, orchestrated by Judge Harris, a man infamous for his openly racist beliefs. The courtroom had been a battlefield, but James had never stood a chance. The verdict was swift, the evidence flimsy, and the prosecutor's words sharp with prejudice. It didn't matter that James had no history with drugs, or that the evidence against him was fabricated. The system, fueled by its deep-seated racial biases, saw only the color of his skin, not the truth of his character. In prison, the brutality was worse than he'd ever imagined. Racial slurs, violence, and neglect were the daily currency of survival. The years blurred together, every day a fight for dignity, for sanity. And yet, through it all, James never stopped believing he would be exonerated. The turning point came when a new piece of evidence emerged, an anonymous tip that proved his innocence. After years of fighting a system stacked against him, James was finally freed. But the victory didn't bring peace. The anger still burned in him, especially toward the man who had sentenced him to that hell. Judge Harris had destroyed his life with a few careless words. Though James vowed to never let his past define him, the weight of that injustice remained, unresolved, deep in his soul. Years after his release, James Williams had carved out a new life. He worked in a legal department, using his experience to help others who had suffered the same injustices he once did. His past, though painful, had been pushed into the shadows. He had fought hard to move on, to redefine himself beyond the prison walls that once confined him. But all of that changed in an instant. It was an ordinary day at the office when the familiar figure walked into the conference room. James was sitting at his desk when he saw him. Judge Harris, the same man who had condemned him to years of suffering, sitting calmly, discussing some case with colleagues as if nothing had ever happened. His presence alone felt like a slap in the face. James's heart pounded in his chest, a rush of rage flooding his mind. The man who had ruined his life was standing there, untouched by the consequences of his actions, walking free while James had to claw his way back from hell. He felt the anger rise, but James had learned over the years to control his emotions. He couldn't let the past dictate his future. Not now, not after all the progress he had made. They didn't speak. Harris didn't acknowledge him, but the cold, dismissive gaze he cast in James's direction was enough. It lingered, filled with disdain, as if he was still the one with the power. James could feel the weight of those years of injustice in that look, years that had destroyed him, years that had stolen his freedom. That moment, brief as it was, marked the beginning of a personal battle James never anticipated. He had thought he had left his past behind, but Judge Harris had unknowingly reopened a wound he wasn't sure he could heal. Over the following months, James found himself locked in an internal struggle. The anger he thought he had buried resurfaced, more intense than ever, every time he saw Judge Harris. It wasn't just that Harris had ruined his life. It was that he was still thriving, untouched by the destruction he had caused. Harris had risen to a position of power and influence, his reputation intact, while James was left to rebuild what was shattered. But this time, James wasn't going to let it slide. He couldn't. James knew he had to keep his emotions in check, that reacting to Harris's mere presence would give him the power he so clearly desired. But it was hard. Every glance from the judge felt like a challenge, a reminder of the years of suffering and torment James had endured. The fire in him burned hotter with every passing day. Determined to get justice, James began his quiet investigation. He reached out to former colleagues, those who had worked with Harris in the past, asking discreet questions about his conduct. The more James dug, the darker the truth became. Harris wasn't just a racist in private. His prejudices had shaped his decisions on the bench. James uncovered case after case where Harris had displayed clear bias, especially against black defendants. The pattern was undeniable. It wasn't just one bad decision. It was a career built on discrimination. The weight of this discovery hit James hard. It was no longer about his own pain and suffering. He couldn't stand by, while Harris continued to wield power, knowing the lives he had destroyed with his racism. The quiet whispers of his investigation soon turned into louder, more confident statements. He began to speak out, initially to trusted colleagues, but as the evidence mounted, so did his resolve. James wasn't just seeking justice for himself anymore. He was fighting to expose the man who had ruined countless lives for his own arrogance and hatred. The truth about Judge Harris slowly began to spread, like wildfire catching the wind. It started with whispers, conversations behind closed doors, hushed but growing louder by the day. James had uncovered a damning ruling, one where Harris had blatantly used his position to discriminate against a black defendant. The evidence was clear, and it didn't take long for the story to surface on social media, rapidly gaining traction. The public outrage was immediate and fierce, as people began to rally against the injustice Harris had inflicted on so many. The moment of reckoning came when James was asked to testify against Harris at a public hearing. It was something James had never imagined would happen. Yet here he was, standing on the cusp of justice. As he prepared to speak, the weight of the moment settled over him. This wasn't just about his own pain anymore. This was for all the black men and women whose lives had been destroyed by Harris's biased rulings. When James took the stand, he wasn't just recounting his own story. He spoke with the voices of the countless others who had been silenced by a system that had failed them. His words were raw, yet measured, and they cut through the room like a blade. He described the pattern of racial bias that had run rampant throughout Harris's career, the lives torn apart by unjust rulings, and the damage done to families and communities. It wasn't just a case of one bad judge. It was a system that had allowed this to continue unchecked for years. The impact was immediate. The judge, once confident in his untouchable position, began to realize the full extent of his own prejudices. By the end of the hearing, Harris was stripped of his position, his reputation in tatters. As the room emptied, James stood tall, the weight of years of suffering finally lifting. The justice he had long fought for was no longer a distant dream. It was real. This wasn't just a victory for him. It was a moment of redemption for all those who had suffered under Harris's racism.